right, so I actually have a handout. I'm going to drop it in the chat right now. Can everyone hear me? All right. Okay, perfect. All right, so violence is a pervasive feature of life under oppression. And sometimes the response from victims is to literally fight back against the injustices that they experience, meeting oppressive violence with violent resistance. Society doesn't provide many resources for nuanced thinking about violent resistance or the individuals who engage in it. Too often, we write these acts off as acts of senseless destruction, and we dismiss their agents as crazy or irrational. The aim of this paper is to improve our understanding of these issues by responding to the following questions. What kinds of reasons, if any, may count in favor of engaging in violent resistance? What ethical conflicts arise for victims when deliberating about whether to engage in such actions? And how do these conflicts affect our ethical evaluations? The current discourse tends to center what I will call paradigmatic moral reasons in their responses to these questions. That is, reasons that arise from commitments to impartial principles of justice and morality. What I want to do is supplement this work by highlighting another source of reasons that bears relevantly in deliberations about violent resistance. Namely, I argue that the personal projects and relationships of those who are oppressed may also provide them with legitimate reasons to engage in violent resistance, and that these reasons come apart from and may sometimes conflict with paradigmatic moral considerations. Indeed, some cases of violent resistance may be understood as situations of what I call, borrowing a term from Susan Wolf, radical choice, in which impartial morality and one's personal projects pull in opposite directions. Thus, even if violent resistance in any given case violates standard moral constraints, for example, on permissible defensive harm, this doesn't settle the question of its ethical value, at least not without further argument. So before I make my case, it will help to clarify the question that I'm addressing and to distinguish it from other questions that it might easily be confused with. The question of what reasons, if any, count in favor of violent resistance is different from the question of whether one should, all things considered, engage in it. So even if we find, as I'm going to argue, that there are reasons that count in favor of violent resistance, for all that I will say, it might still be true that all things considered, one should not engage in it. Likewise, the question of this paper is not whether violent resistance is admirable or praiseworthy. I will not be recommending or praising any particular form of resistance here. So to be very clear, I'm not endorsing violence here, neither in general, nor in any particular case. Instead, I will make the much weaker point that some of the pro-tanto normative considerations that go into the balance when deliberating about whether to engage in violent resistance are personal reasons arising from individuals' projects and relationships, and that such reasons are not guaranteed to cohere with the paradigmatic demands of impartial morality. So why should we address this weaker question about the pro-tanto reasons that might favor violent resistance? Aren't the important questions whether violent resistance is justified, all things considered, or whether such actions exemplify virtue? I think that it's worth taking up this weaker question for at least two reasons. First, judging whether an agent acted virtuously or justifiably is going to require careful consideration of the pro-tanto reasons in favor of her actions and how she weighs and balances them in practical deliberation. Second, failing to consider the variety of possible grounds for violent resistance, including those that may be less ideal, can easily lead to distortions or misapprehensions of actual cases. So although this paper has a weaker aim, I think it's nonetheless a crucial one for addressing the more ambitious questions. Okay, so turning now to the central question of the paper, let's begin by considering the paradigmatic moral reasons for violent resistance. So paradigmatic moral reasons arise from commitments to principles of impartial justice and morality, such as human dignity and equality, or the collective good. They are centrally concerned with the difference between right and wrong action, the grounds and limits of our moral obligations, and protecting and promoting the equally weighted needs and interests of others in society at large. They're characteristically impartial and agent neutral, applying to individuals in virtue of their shared moral status, independently of any special traits or qualities. Moreover, paradigmatic moral reasons reflect the fact that each of us is just one person among others, equally deserving of respect and well-being. Reasons of this sort are most explicitly represented in traditional moral theories, such as deontology and consequentialism. Moreover, they often take the form of requirements or limitations on action. For instance, by stating a duty to respect a basic principle or to promote a certain good. Paradigmatic moral reasons are well represented in the current literature, especially in discussions of violent protest. So three are commonly discussed. First, violent protest may aim to eliminate injustices in public policy and legislation. So Pasternak argues that political riots do this by using shock tactics, such as open confrontation with the police, to draw attention to the plight of the oppressed and to wrestle concessions from policymakers. Second is the aim of effective public communication over injustices. So as Kling and Mitchell have argued, violent protest may sometimes be required to engage in meaningful, consistent public communication about injustice. And third is the defense of human dignity and equality. So for instance, in his discussion of Frederick Douglass's fight with Covey, Bernard Boxall argues that Douglass resolved to fight his enslaver because, quote, he believed that his nature as a moral being required that he stand up for the principles of morality, end quote, which provided him with the right not to be physically abused. So given the serious costs of violence, philosophers also discuss several moral constraints on its permissible use, many of which are drawn from the literature on just conduct in war. I won't be able to describe them in any detail here, but these constraints include necessity, proportionality, success, and what I call fairness, or what is sometimes called the innocent bystander exception. Okay, so paradigmatic moral reasons undoubtedly provide some of the most important considerations when deliberating about whether to engage in violent resistance. However, they're not the only reasons that may be relevant here. There are also personal reasons arising from people's attachments to their personal projects and relationships. By contrast with paradigmatic moral reasons, personal reasons are centrally concerned with upholding the resistor's own special desires and interests, or those of people they love or to whom they are loyal. They're characteristically partial and agent relative, applying to individuals in virtue of their personal attachments, which they may not share with other people and which may not be reasonably expected of everyone. So for example, the well-being of one's child, the call to continue a family legacy, or the desire to take revenge or cause the suffering of an enemy are all examples of personal reasons that may bear relevantly on whether to engage in an act of violence against oppression. So although some authors have argued that such reasons are not moral, but actually represent a category of non-moral values. I will not make such an assumption here. The distinction between paradigmatic moral reasons and personal reasons need not hinge on whether the latter category is genuinely moral. Instead, what draws personal reasons apart from paradigmatic moral reasons is their personal and partial nature and their lack of explicit consideration for human equality or the common good. Moreover, personal reasons may or may not cohere with morality. So in some cases, such as when they take the form of a desire to cause suffering or to take revenge, they may well be morally questionable. So what I want to do next, illustrate the personal reasons that may be involved in violent resistance using 3 examples. These are all on your handout. So the first one is the case of Margaret Garner. So Garner and her family escaped slavery by traveling across the frozen Ohio River to Cincinnati in the winter of 1856. They were soon captured by US Marshals, and rather than return her back to slavery, Garner killed her 2-year-old daughter with a butcher's knife. Reporting on this conversation, on his conversation with Garner in jail, Baptist minister P.S. Bassett writes, and this quote is also on the handout, I inquired if she was not excited almost to madness when she committed the act. No, she replied, I was as cool as I now am, and I would much rather kill them at once and thus end their sufferings than have them back to slavery and be murdered piecemeal. She alludes to the child that she killed as being free from all trouble and sorrow with a degree of satisfaction that almost chills the blood in one's veins. Yet she evidently possesses all the passionate tenderness of a mother's love. So Bassett's report makes it very clear that Garner's violent resistance was not the result of a bout of madness or irrationality. Rather, it was done soberly for reasons of maternal love, which Garner continued to stand by well after the incident. As she stated in their conversation, Garner was not willing to allow her children to go through the horrors that she had suffered under slavery. Her maternal love provided her with a personal reason to engage in this act of violent resistance. Okay, so the next case is the case of Adrienne Bennett, who is actually the first Black woman master plumber in North America. Bennett, who is now the CEO of her own contracting company, faced serious and constant sexual harassment from her all-male colleagues during her 5-year apprenticeship in the 1980s. One day, Bennett decided to respond to this harassment by physically assaulting a man who touched her. Describing the incident, she says, and I'm not going to say the expletives in the interest of keeping the talk family friendly, but this is what she says. By this time, I was so tired of them putting their hands on me. I grabbed a pipe wrench out of my tool belt. I came down on the top of his hard hat and I said, it stops today. You pass the word. The next effer that puts their hands on me will die and I will go to prison happily. I literally split that hard hat in half. I could have killed him. I didn't have any more problems after that. So in interviews, Bennett describes the acts of resistance that she engaged in during this time as stemming from her dedication and commitment to achieving her dream of being successful in her career. So as she states, I'm honest, hardworking, and I don't let anyone get in my way and cheat me out of my dream. So as she reports, her violent resistance successfully ended her colleagues' harassment, helping her to complete her apprenticeship. So she says, I didn't have any problems after that. I think Bennett's story suggests that among the reasons for assaulting the man who touched her, breaking his hard hat in two and nearly killing him, were strong personal reasons having to do with her loyalty to herself and to the career that she had devoted her life to. Okay, the third and final case that I'm going to talk about is taken from the life of Egyptian journalist and activist Mona El-Tahawi. El-Tahawi talks about how she has been sexually harassed on numerous occasions in her life. She writes about how in the past she tended to turn the other cheek, but now in her 50s, she's starting to respond more aggressively. One time, El-Tahawi beat up a man who groped her on the dance floor by pushing him to the ground, sitting on top of him, and punching him repeatedly in the face. Describing the reasons for her violence, El-Tahawi emphasizes that she wanted to make the man afraid of her and to make him feel the consequences of his misogynistic acts. In recent writings, El-Tahawi has actually declared it her personal mission to, quote unquote, terrify the patriarchy. In particular, she wants men who dare to harass or subordinate her to fear that there will be consequences for their actions, and that she is both personally willing and able to dole out those consequences herself, specifically in the form of violence. So what I'm suggesting is that among El-Tahawi's reasons for beating up the man who groped her were personal reasons arising from this commitment that she writes about in her book, this commitment to terrifying the agents of misogyny and to making them suffer for their misogynistic actions. Okay, so those are the three cases. What are we to make of these cases of violent resistance? Well, I've been presenting them to make the point that personal projects and relationships that are being undermined by oppression may provide people with reasons to engage in violent resistance. And these reasons are not entirely reducible to and may come apart from paradigmatic moral considerations. It's not the aim of this paper to provide a moral assessment of violent resistance, neither in general nor in any individual case. However, I think it's worth noting that at least at first glance, the actions that I've just been describing in the previous three cases seem to clash with some of the moral constraints on permissible defensive harm. So one could argue, for instance, that by killing her daughter, Garner kills an innocent bystander, thereby violating the condition on fairness, or that by resorting to extreme physical force, El-Tahawi and Bennett pushed the limits of proportionality and necessity. However, I don't really think that this provides a final answer as to whether such actions are, all things considered, morally justifiable. There may be other ways of defending them and accounting for their moral value. But instead of attempting to reach a moral verdict on the cases here, I want to highlight a couple general points about violent resistance that I think is suggested, are suggested by the discussion so far. Okay, I think that recognizing the distinction between paradigmatic moral reasons and personal reasons allows us to consider the possibility that conflicts may arise in practical deliberations about violent resistance. That is, sometimes when resisting oppression, there will be tensions between what one has reason to do from the point of view of impartial morality and what one has reason to do from the point of view of one's personal projects and relationships. So violent resistance may sometimes arise from situations of what Susan Wolf calls radical choice. Situations of radical choice are situations in which there is, this is a quote from Wolf, a conflict between impartial morality and the demands of personal love and loyalty. Wolf illustrates radical choice by considering the example of a loving mother whose son has committed a serious crime and who has to decide whether to turn him in or to hide him from the police and allow an innocent man to be convicted in his place. From the point of view of impartial morality, Woolf argues the mother is morally obligated to turn in her son, but maternal love urges her to consider flouting that obligation to prevent his suffering. When conflicts such as these arise, Woolf argues that it's not always clear that morality should take categorical priority. Indeed, Woolf contends it may be reasonable on occasion to violate one's moral duty for the sake of oneself or a friend or a cause or an ideal that is of special personal importance. So because she loves him, it would not be unreasonable for the mother to at least consider protecting her son. And if she chooses to hide him, if she can't bring herself to turn him in, the mother may be acting against her moral obligations, but she's not necessarily acting irrationally or unreasonably, because her action would be undertaken for personal reasons of maternal love. So after all, says Woolf, if the meaning of one's life and one's very identity is bound up with someone as deeply as a mother's life is characteristically tied to her son's, why should the dictates of impartial morality be regarded as decisive? So I think the same can be said of violent resistance. Rather than dismissing morally questionable acts of violent resistance as worthless or irrational, I think we should attempt to understand the personal reasons that may be in play in them. And independently of how they measure up on the scale of impartial morality, I think that such actions may have some personal value. So for example, by allowing victims to uphold projects and relationships that are under threat by their oppression. And I think studying the personal reasons for violence might provide some insight into this personal value. So even if such acts are immoral or at least morally questionable, this doesn't really settle the question of their ethical value, at least not without further argument. So just to conclude real quick, violent resistance is no doubt a delicate and complex phenomenon. The question of what circumstances give rise to it does not really lend itself to easy or definitive answers. My aim here has not been to simplify our understanding of it, nor is it my aim to provide a way of resolving conflicts of radical choice that might come up in these contexts. Instead, my aim is to draw out some of the ethical complexities that are involved in violent resistance with the aim of improving our understanding of it and of the people who engage in it. Not only is such an understanding crucial for better, more accurate theorizing about violent resistance, but I think it also has practical advantages. Namely, understanding these ethical complexities allows us to better sympathize with the individuals who are pushed to such extremes, and to properly acknowledge and give uptake to their struggles. That's it. Thank you.
Cool. So if you have a question, feel free to write question in the chat or type out your question if you feel more comfortable doing that. Yeah, Jen Kling.
Hi, Tamara.
Hi, Jen.
Hello. Oh my gosh. So I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much. So I think my question is, and forgive me, I arrived like a minute or two late, so maybe I just missed it. But I am wondering if you could say a little bit more about in what sense you're understanding these choices as radical. And maybe it's just the particular perspective that I'm coming from. As you know, I've sort of worked on violent resistance a little bit. And so I just sort of think these things are morally, I'm like, yeah, they're fine. Like, not fine, but like, I think there are clear arguments that can be made. And so I'm just wondering about the sense in which these are radical choices, right? Because sort of the idea of radicality, right, means, or at least in my understanding, right, means something sort of like beyond the pale, right, or something that we wouldn't expect somebody to choose. But many of the cases that you described, I think it's part of the reason they're so compelling is you think like, yes, that is rational, that is moral, or at least we can completely understand it. And so I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the sense of radical that you're using.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I'm using the term radical to, first of all, because I'm pulling it from Susan Wolf's work, and she describes this as the case of radical choice. But I think that we can understand it as radical in the sense that these agents are choosing not to act for paradigmatic moral reasons, but rather for these personal reasons. And in many of the cases, they know that what they're doing might be morally wrong or at least morally questionable, but they do it anyway. And so in that sense, it's radical, choosing not to do what, there is a moral option for you. Like you could refrain from punching the guy repeatedly in the face just because he groped you. Like that's not, that's not like, but you do it anyway, knowing that, yeah, my morality might say otherwise, but I don't care because I'm committed to terrifying the patriarchy, as in the case of El Tahawi. But yeah, I guess that's, I'm not in disagreement about the idea that we might be able to provide moral arguments to justify some of these cases. But nonetheless, I don't think there are cases that are done for paradigmatic moral reasons. So if they do satisfy moral obligations, or if they have positive consequences politically, these are sort of unintended side effects. I don't think they're done for those reasons.
No, thank you. That's helpful to think about the ways in which people themselves might recognize themselves as acting radically, right? In a certain kind of sense. Is that the idea? Okay, cool. No, thank you.
Cool, thank you. And I totally forgot, I realized while Jen Kling was talking to say thanks to the speaker and have everyone give her a round of applause. But I guess, yeah, our next question is from Paul Wilson. Paul Wilson, would you like to read it, or should I? I guess it says in the second and third case.
Yep. Well, the second and third case, I'm wondering if these are intentional premeditated choices or are these just reactions on the moment? And would that matter in a radical choice? This is just how I react in a situation. So I'm not thinking, I'm not planning my moral response, I'm just doing.
Yeah, so I think that in the case of Bennett, she doesn't plan it in advance. So in that case, I think it is more of a reaction. In the case, she has thought about this before, and she's sort of reflected and written about like ways in which she had responded to sexual harassment before and how she's now choosing to respond more aggressively. So I think that's more of a case that has been, it's more deliberate than, not that I want to say Bennett's case is not deliberate, like she knew what she was doing. But I want to say that it doesn't necessarily matter to cases of radical choice whether the person has sort of sat down and thought about it in the moment, or whether this has been just, I mean, for Bennett, like she's been harassed over and over again, and we can imagine that she might have like fantasized about doing something like this before. So even if in the moment she, even if she didn't like wake up that morning and say, today I'm going to, fight back, I think that it was still part of her, what are the words for this? I don't want to say they're by accident or mere reactions. I want to say that there is, there's still deliberate choices, even if in the moment it wasn't like planned out and premeditated in the way that like a protest is, for example.
Great, thank you. And next we have a question by Kate Schmidt. Would you, or I guess, do you think there are any ways to get started on thinking about which kinds of personal reasons or personal projects are not morally relevant, or will it depend on a case-by-case basis?
I think that, I mean, some personal reasons, like a desire to inflict suffering or to take revenge, these already are sort of morally valenced in a negative way. So we sort of have intuitively thoughts about personal reasons that are immoral, irrelevant to morality. I mean, I feel like, things like resisting for aesthetic reasons, for example. I mean, if you are resisting in a way that where the reason is to preserve a cultural heritage or to preserve something because it's beautiful or aesthetically valuable, I don't really see morality being like necessarily relevant there. Even though we can make moral evaluations in those cases, like the reasons that the people are engaging in resistance might not be moral reasons. But I do think that it's important to go a case-by-case analysis, and I wouldn't want to just come up with an abstract principle that captures all the cases. I don't know if there is one, or if there is, I haven't really thought about it very much, but yeah.
Awesome. Joseph Orozco.
Hi, sorry, I was just making sure to my audio was working. Thank you, Tamara. This was really, really quite fascinating. I had a question about thinking about whether the sort of objective conditions of oppression matter in terms of how you evaluate these kinds of cases. Because I was wondering, like, how would you, or would you differentiate the kinds of cases that you've mentioned in your paper from the kinds of cases, like I'm thinking about the men that murdered Matthew Shepard because of using the gay panic defense, right? In those cases, they felt that they were being harassed, whether objectively or not. The question is that they claimed that their experience was of a certain type, resisting something that they found to be morally repugnant, oppressive in some sense, and they acted in the way they did. That's a different kind of case, it seems, objectively, than speaking of the kinds of cases in which you were talking about people fighting against something that are serious cases of marginalization, violence, right? The 5 faces of oppression kind of thing, like real cases of oppression. I'm also thinking about, does it make a difference then if we think about like the people who were at the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., who many of them sincerely believed, I think, that they were trying to save the nation from something that they consider to be illegitimate, from an oppressive, tyrannical government. Do those kinds of cases, are they different in the sense, in the way that they use violence from the way in which you're talking in your paper?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the scope of my paper is focused on violent resistance to oppression. And a lot of the cases that you mentioned, are not cases of resistance to oppression. So that's one way in which it's different. Another way is that I
But
think that,
if I may,
yeah.
just a question. I mean, I think that's my question is like
Yeah.
how, like, it seems that what needs to be counted of as oppression in order for the work that you're doing to count? Because to say
Mhm.
they're not cases of oppression, I agree, but it seems a part of what your work is doing is it depends on defining what that is to say what these reactions are. So I apologize for, but that was my question. I guess I was
Yeah.
unclear about what I was talking about.
Oh, no, that's super helpful. So, I mean, I feel like some of the things that I say about violent resistance, like to oppression, such as that, there are personal reasons for it, might carry over to some of the cases that you're talking about. So, people who went and, like the Capitol rioters, they had personal reasons for doing they did. These just kind of acts as crazy or also serves as we can do to, fix the conditions that make that kind of thing possible. So I don't want to say that in the cases that you have in mind, people don't have personal reasons, or or that those reasons are not interesting to like investigate. I'm also not giving a moral defense of violent resistance here. So I'm not saying that in these three cases, the violence was morally justified. So does my account depend on a definition of oppression? Like, I mean, I think that I can just presuppose the great work that has been done on explaining oppression, such as Iris Marion Young's work, Marilyn Frye's work, among others. Oppression as a systemic injustice that serves to reduce and immobilize a certain group of people because of their group membership. So I think that that's the kind of understanding of oppression that's in the background here. Yeah, and I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you so much for your very interesting and engaging talk, and to everyone who asked a question. It looks like we've reached time, so I will give the floor to Will Barnes, whom I think is chairing the next session. And Joel, yeah.
Hey, everybody. I think maybe I may have made a critical mistake here, and that I was under the impression that I was going to be chairing the resistance and persistence panel. But I've just arrived because I had a meeting and I hear Tamara talking about her paper. Have I made a mistake here and Tamara's already presented her work? Well, I sincerely apologize. I just came out of a scheduled meeting about a podcast on ethics that I'm going to be working on, and I've made a crucial error in timing. So I sincerely apologize, Tamara. And so the indication that I'm going to be chairing the next session is that, have I been shunted along there now? Is that the decision? Or are we just going to proceed with the original schedule that I've messed up personally, and I again sincerely apologize for?
Will, you just need to introduce Joel and then carry on.
Okay. Well, 1 second, please. Okay. Well, again, my sincere apologies, Tamara. I'm very interested in your paper, and thankfully this has been recorded, so I will be able to benefit from your wisdom and insight. So it's with my great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Joel Bolivian, is that correct? Or is it Joel Bolivian from the University of Wisconsin at Madison? And he'll be giving his paper on racial apathy and the persistence of injustice. So thank you so much, Joel, and take it away whenever you are ready.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. I'm going to submit a little link to my PowerPoint slides. So if anyone wants to follow along, they're free to do so. Thank you so much, Will. Really appreciate that. Sorry about your circumstances, and thank you to Rachel for organizing this. So I'm just going to quickly put up my screen. And I also apologize for coming in late. I was lecturing leading up to this. Can someone just give me a thumbs up if they can see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. All right, so my name is Joel. I'm from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. I'm a PhD student, and I'm just going to jump right into this talk. The title of this talk is Racial Apathy and the Persistence of Injustice. Consider the following quote by Martin Luther King. It may well be that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition is not the glaring noisiness of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. It may be that our generation will have to repent not only for the diabolical actions and vitriolic words of the children of darkness, but also for the crippling fears and tragic apathy of the children of light. It's this emphasis on apathy and indifference that I really want to focus on. And probably starting around like the late 90s, and there was some work before that, but especially coming into the 2000s, a lot of social psychologists were very interested in this phenomenon of apathy. In particular, apathy about racial inequality and apathy about racial harms. So Foreman is one of the sociologists who's been doing a lot of work since the early 2000s on racial apathy, trying to understand it and its contribution to social inequality. So here's how he defines racial apathy. Broadly, racial apathy refers to lack of feeling or indifference toward societal, racial, and ethnic inequality, and a lack of engagement with race-related social issues. It is expressed in at least two ways: a lack of concern about racial and ethnic disparities, and an unwillingness to address proximal and distal forms of racially disparate treatment. So that's sort of the rough idea. And why is this concept so important to social psychologists? Well, the idea is that post-civil rights movement, overt prejudice has become less popular. It's not something that is appropriate to display, the idea goes. But nonetheless, post-civil rights movement, lots of racial disparities, lots of social vulnerabilities assailing racial minorities in the United States continue to exist. And so what a lot of people have argued is that even though overt prejudice has shifted, there's this new phenomenon called racial apathy that continues to hold racial inequalities in place, or at least it plays some part. And there are really two ways of thinking about the relationship between racial apathy and prejudice. There's the replacement thesis, which claims that apathy has replaced overt prejudice. So overt prejudice has basically, there's diminished in the general population, but unfortunately, this other new attitude called racial apathy has risen in its place and explains a lot of these enduring inequalities. On the other hand, a lot of people like Foreman and others have argued that racial apathy is actually an expression of racial justice. It's not just replacing, an expression of racial prejudice. It's not just replacing overt racial prejudice. It's actually an expression of the prejudice that has always been there. And of course, these two are not incompatible theses. Now, I want to return to this quote by Foreman. He talks about how apathy is defined as this indifference towards inequalities, and it's expressed in a lack of concern about racial harms and so on. Here's a question I'm curious to know your thoughts about. If you just want to, I don't know if this is appropriate, but even just like type in some of your answers in the chat, and I can come back to it later, or maybe during the Q&A, you can like send me some stuff, or maybe in an email. But I really want to know, what are white Americans indifferent about when it comes to race issues? Foreman argues that racial apathy targets inequality. And I have this sense that that's not the full story. When we think about the analysandum here, I want to argue that apathy has a broader scope than mere inequalities. So I want to say that apathy is directed at harms, for example, police aggression, vulnerabilities, like certain health vulnerabilities in minority communities, deprivations, the lack of adequate housing. So call all these things social harms. And of course, an inequality might be a type of vulnerability. It might display a certain kind of harm, but I want to say that inequalities aren't identical to harms, vulnerabilities, and deprivations, but nevertheless, a lot of white Americans seem to be apathetic about these things, what I call social harms, as well as apathetic about claims that African Americans in specific face these social harms. Second, I want to argue that apathy may be subject-directed or state of affairs directed. So think about the difference between being apathetic about a person or a group, like just having low levels of care about African Americans versus caring about African Americans, but having low levels of care about certain social harms that assail them. Now, in this paper, I'm going to focus on state of affairs directed apathy, in part because it seems very difficult in my mind to make sense of subject-directed apathy without prejudice. It seems like if I'm apathetic about a subject or a group, that either constitutes prejudice or is best explained by prejudice. Maybe there's an argument for showing that it's not exactly prejudice, but in any case, I'm going to focus on state of affairs apathy, where white indifference is directed towards social harms, vulnerabilities, or deprivations that assail racial minorities. And I'll focus on African Americans primarily in this talk. So with that in mind, here's my sort of rough view of what racial apathy is. Racial apathy refers to low levels of care about or indifference toward racial harms and inequalities. Now, a question that a lot of philosophers are interested in when they come to this literature, or that I think they should be interested in, is why is racial apathy bad? What are the bad-making properties? And I think one obvious answer has to do with this outcome-centered badness, where we say that racial apathy enables the persistence of racial harms and slows amelioration of those harms. So this is a kind of like consequentialist analysis of the badness of apathy. When apathy is prevalent enough in the general population, it really slows the progress towards racial justice and allows very systemic racial injustices to remain in place, especially if the apathy is found within the dominant group. But I kind of want to focus on a different way of explaining the badness of apathy, where it's erotaic or attitudinal, where we're asking about the character of the individual. And the idea here would be that racial apathy constitutes a vice, or it's some sort of blameworthy moral deficiency, and thereby renders the agent criticizable. Okay, so I'm going to focus on erotaic attitudinal badness in this paper. And here's the thing. So a lot of people in the literature, a lot of this social psychologists doing work in this, think that apathy expresses racial prejudice. And I think that's right. I think it very often does. And I think if that were true, in the cases where it's true, I think its badness, its erotaic badness is clear. And here's the argument, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. The argument starts with this premise: prejudice is a vice. And second premise: agents are criticizable for expressing vice. Therefore, apathy as an expression of vice renders the agent criticizable. So there's this kind of like inheritance thesis where the expression, in this case apathy, inherits the viciousness of the thing it expresses, namely the prejudice. It's tainted in virtue of what it expresses. So I think this argument's pretty strong. I'm sure there are ways of pushing back on this, but it seems to me that you might have other explanations for the prevalence of apathy amongst the dominant group in the United States. And one explanation is doubt. So I'll say more about this, but the basic idea is this: it seems to me that a lot of white Americans are doubtful about the social harms assailing racial minorities. When I have conversations with students, family members, friends, people in my community, I often hear them articulate doubts, and I'll explain what kind of doubts I hear. But it seems to me also that this doubting about the severity or the badness of social harms connects with the apathy that they manifest. The very people I run into who are apathetic about racial harms are also doubtful about those racial harms. And it seems like there's a kind of connection here. And so very often, but not always, it seems to me that apathy is going to be explained by doubts that a lot of people have. And what then? Because the argument I just gave doesn't obviously apply to this. In this case, apathy is not an expression of prejudice necessarily. It might be the result of doubt. What follows? So what kind of doubt do I have in mind? There are at least two types of doubting that I run into when I have these conversations. What I call status doubting. Here, S does not doubt that a social harm is real, but she does doubt that it constitutes an injustice. So she denies it's this profound moral status that people are claiming it has. This is evidenced in cases where, say, whites think that racial inequalities are the result of personal failure or cultural setbacks. Sorry, there's a typo here. I didn't finish the slide. So sometimes people talk about cultures of poverty, how there are these tendencies and characteristics of impoverished communities that keeps them in poverty, that explains why they're impoverished. And I run into a lot of people who recognize that there are various inequalities. The black-white wealth gap is a massive inequality in the United States. But when I hear people analyze this, a lot of white people I talk to say, yeah, but I just don't think that's an injustice because that's the product of, and then fill in the blank with some sort of sociological story about why, say, the Black community is blameworthy or responsible for their own inequalities here. On the other hand, you might have what I call severity doubting. In this case, S does not doubt that a social harm is real, but she does doubt that it is a serious harm. This is evidenced in cases where whites downplay the extent of, say, police brutality against minorities, the extent of hiring discrimination, the legacy and impact of housing discrimination. So I have a friend who I'm talking to about hiring discrimination, trying to share with him some of the evidence about hiring discrimination against African Americans. And his big response is like, look, I just don't think this happens all that often. Or people will sometimes say when it comes to the wealth gap, they'll say, sure, like maybe housing discrimination in the 20th century led to this wealth gap, but it didn't have that big of a causal connection to it. And moreover, housing discrimination wasn't that severe, and it no longer is that severe. And so any resultant inequality, any continuing inequalities aren't that severe. So there's a downplaying of the severity of the badness of a thing. So these are the two types of doubting that I run into when I have conversations with people. And so here are my starting points and a puzzle I want to discuss with you all. First, I start with this idea that there's the reality of doubt. Many whites are apathetic because of genuine doubts they have about social harms assailing racial minorities. This is compatible with saying that they also have some prejudice and so on. I'm not trying to say that there isn't prejudice resulting in apathy, but I do think doubt plays a role here as well. But then second, consider what I call the exculpatory power of doubt. It often seems that genuine doubt exculpates the wrongdoer. And really simple cases model this. So you're walking past Peter Singer's pond and there's a child in need of your rescue. It would be very easy to rescue them. And so you morally ought to, but you walk past the pond. So you've done something wrong. There's a wrongdoing here. But suppose we learn that you were listening to music or you were off in your thoughts thinking about this conference. And so you just didn't even realize, you didn't know that the child was there. So failing to know is like the most, I guess it's like the limiting case of doubt. But suppose you just had doubts that there was a child there, like really strong doubts that there was a child drowning. You might think that this exculpates the wrongdoer to some degree. But then finally, it seems to me that criticism is apt when it comes to many of these whites who have apathy. So the idea is that many whites are nevertheless criticizable and blameworthy for even their doubt-induced apathy. Even when doubt is the explanation for why a lot of whites don't engage in racial justice initiatives, why they don't support it, I want to say there's still a criticism here. There's still a kind of vice involved. So this is the puzzle I'm trying to unravel in this paper. It seems to me that a lot of people I know have doubts about social harms, and as a result, they don't address it. They don't talk about it. They don't try to undo it. They're not committed to allyship because they just doubt that there's anything there worth or that exists in order to be an ally for. So my proposal turns on this idea of hyperpoliticization. My claim is that hyperpoliticization explains a lot of white doubt, and hyperpoliticization is vicious. So it thereby renders the apathetic agent criticizable. So the idea is that apathy rooted in genuine doubt is criticizable when doubt is explained by hyperpoliticization. Apathy rooted in genuine doubt is criticizable when the doubt is explained by hyperpoliticization. So what do I mean by hyperpoliticization? I'm not going to try to define it. I still think it's a concept it's developing, and I think it's a bit nebulous, but I think there's something out there like this. And roughly, I would describe it as a form of political concern and political engagement that gives inordinate devotion to one's political commitments and places outsized ethical importance on certain political outcomes. Inordinate devotion and outsized ethical importance. And I just want to be clear about something. Political engagement and political concern is very reasonable. It can be a vice. It can be a very good thing. Hyperpoliticization is like a leveled up version of that. It's this inordinate concern about political outcomes, political Trojan horses, and it places outsized ethical importance on all these things. So this is kind of a normative description of the phenomenon. Now, let me just describe how this plays out. How does this inordinate devotion to political outcomes play out? Well, I argue that hyperpoliticizing involves an inordinate focus on any potential political threats, political assumptions, or political victories present or perceived in a discussion. One of the hyperpoliticizer's greatest concerns in public discourse or in a conversation about social issues is the potential weaponization of the topic against their political commitments. Additionally, they are on the lookout for ways to weaponize the issue against their political opponents. This is a disposition to be on the lookout. All of us care about political outcomes, and that's right. Hyperpoliticization is this disposition to be in this state of constantly looking out for where the political threats arise and where the political victories could arise as well. So let me give you some examples of potential hyperpoliticization, and then we'll talk about why I think these are a form of vice. So consider the following case. This is a case, true story here, describing someone I know. I'll call them Jack. Jack is catching up with Sam and describes how he recently felt convicted after hearing a sermon about wealth and generosity. So Jack says to his friend Sam, "I find it concerning how consumeristic Americans can be. We're guided by a way of life that prioritizes material gain and affluence." Sam's immediate response is, "Well, you know, the poor are no exception. Do you see what happens when they get a bonus or a welfare check?" And Sam goes on to explain that like even the poor can be consumeristic and given towards materialism. And as I'll explain in a second, this isn't just a jab at the poor. In these contexts, there is a political outcome that Sam is looking for. Here's a variation of this case that I've had a conversation like this a number of times. So again, you might say something like, "I find it concerning how consumeristic Americans be. We're guided by a way of life that prioritizes material gain and affluence." And Sam, the Sam I talked to, would say something like, "Yeah, you know, greed is bad, but people need to learn personal responsibility. And socialism doesn't teach that." Okay, socialism doesn't teach that. And then they go on to have a conversation about why exactly that is. Let's analyze these cases. What I think is going on here is that Sam is displaying a type of hyperpoliticization by her tendency to read the situation as a potential indictment of her preferred fiscal policy. For example, maybe trickle-down economics. It could be something else, but here's just an example. Jack's point about American materialism is either perceived as an attempt to score political points in favor of a progressive distributive scheme, or it could be used to do so. So this is how Sam is reading the conversation. Maybe Jack is trying to make a point about needing more progressive distributive schemes and so on. Either of these outcomes is concerning to the hyperpoliticizer. Hence, the hyperpoliticizer attempts to rebuff these potential threats by implying that the assumed alternative would not succeed, or by overtly introducing her argument against the assumed alternative. So in the second response, Sam just comes out and says, like, I don't think socialism would work. So she is reading Jack as trying to defend socialism here. Now, here's a case that involves race issues. Maybe some of you have had conversations like this. So Jane says to Jack, I'm very concerned about the school to prison pipeline. We need a system that works better for African Americans. Or she might say something like this is unjust. We need change here. We need reform. And Jack responds to Jane by saying, well, you know, Biden signed legislation that was responsible for increasing the incarceration rate of African American men. Notice that the conversation immediately goes to a political point. There's a type of political victory or a political confrontation, political defense that needs to happen. And the conversation can't just be about the social harm assailing African Americans. It can't just be about the way the system is working. We can't just talk about potential solutions. We've got to make an effort to score political points. This is a characteristic of hyperpoliticizing. There are some speech act implications for hyperpoliticizing. The first one is what I call context confusion. The hyperpoliticizer tends to misread a conversational context by seeing political challenges implied by her conversation partner. So she sees political challenges that aren't actually there. On the other hand, you might have what's called, I call context infusion. The hyperpoliticizer tends to adjust the conversational context, or what people call the conversational script, by infusing it with opportunities to rebuff political threats or score political points. And so, I mean, you might imagine that in this case, Jack didn't misread the context. Like maybe he's like, yeah, I know that Jane isn't trying to have a political conversation, but I'm going to readjust the context so that this becomes apt in the conversation. I'm going to introduce political confrontation. That's political infusion. So these are the characteristics of hyperpoliticization. But now consider some other cases. I think they're going to reveal some important things about hyperpoliticization. So Jack posts on social media and says, you know, it's very like candid, just says, look, it took me a while to understand what white privilege is and that it exists. Same goes for systemic racism. Here are some of the evidences I found helpful as I wrestled with these issues. And then he gets a response like this. How is this not a front for critical race theory? And you realize critical race theory is inspired by Marxism. So this is, I basically copied and pasted this response onto this PowerPoint. And I just want to point out here that what the hyperpoliticizer does in this case is they focus on hidden political agendas. They don't approach with curiosity. They don't intend to fully learn the concepts. They're very invested in the political outcomes and the political worries latent within the conversation. Or consider this case. This is a case from a friend of mine. So in the summer of 2020, Jane approaches her church leaders and encourages the pursuit of corporate lament over the string of killings of targeting African Americans, even suggesting that their church should acknowledge the complicity of its own denomination in historic wrongdoings against African Americans. Jack, who is a pastoral staff member, expresses reservations and says, if we engage in lament over this matter, what kind of political claims or commitments are we tacitly signing on to? And unfortunately, this church never went on to pursue lament over this issue because these political worries won out. And I want to suggest that this is characteristic of hyperpoliticization, that even when political concern is conversationally felicitous, and even when it is reasonable to wonder about political moves, the hyperpoliticizer makes her political worries the focus. They have outsized ethical implications. Look, it's talking about lamenting injustices against minorities. That might have some political things you need to ask about. There might be something there. But the idea is that for the hyperpoliticizer, those political implications are the focus. They carry the day. So that roughly is, I think, some of the ways that hyperpoliticization functions. And I think it's clear to me that this is a type of vice, and that there are various vice-making properties of hyperpoliticization. The first one is inapt conditionality. The idea is that empathy, curiosity, and regard for human rights and human flourishing are pursued on the condition that political worries are assuaged. So go back to the case about critical race theory. I first have to assuage people that the conversation we're having isn't necessarily tied to critical race theory, or that critical race theory isn't necessarily tied to the political concerns they have, before they'll enter into that conversation, before they'll turn on their empathetic faculties. And so in general, hyperpoliticizers subordinate or conditionalize the pursuit of these other very important virtues to their political concerns. Second, there's an inordinate focus, it seems to me, with hyperpoliticization. It lends energy and attention primarily to political worries. Again, political worries are great. We ought to have them. But the idea is that there's an inordinate focus. Worries about dignity, worries about flourishing, worries about injustice kind of are lower down in the stack than they ought to be. And then there's a kind of neglectfulness involved in hyperpoliticization, but I'm still developing this idea. So if you have thoughts about that, I'd love to hear it. Okay, how does this lead to doubt? Well, it seems clear to me that epistemic liabilities of all sorts arise when you engage in hyperpoliticization, when you're disposed to hyperpoliticize. Here are at least 4. Evidential overlook. Hyperpoliticization leads to overlooking evidences and arguments bearing on the question of injustice and the severity of social harms. The person who's worried about the Trojan horse of Marxism, if that's their big worry, they're not going to engage your arguments. They're not going to look at the evidences. They're going to want you to diffuse their political worries. So they lose an opportunity to acquire evidence about the reality and severity of social harms. Second, evidential distrust. So you might distrust the sources bearing on the question. So I recently talked with a friend and gave them some, this longitudinal study that came out of Harvard about hiring discrimination. And they just said, look, that's a liberal institution. I don't trust it. And people might have reasons to distrust liberal institutions or conservative institutions. But what I know about this friend is that their political worries is what leads them to distrust this source. And I can't even use it in the conversation because it triggers this political concern. Third, imaginative failure. This is failure to imagine how key concepts and claims could be detached from the political agendas one fears. So this is like one of the more salient epistemic liabilities. If you want to talk with someone about systemic racism, for example, it's depending on what their political worries are, it's going to be very hard to have that conversation because they're going to think, like one thing I hear a lot of people say is like, well, systemic racism is developed by critical race theorists and critical race theorists are attached to Marxism, or systemic racism is something the left is pushing. And that might be true. I don't think it is. I don't think systemic racism is crucially tied to critical race theory. I think people can develop this concept independent of their commitments to critical race theory, independent of their commitments to lots of different things. But if you are hyper-politicizing, you have a failure of imagination here. You can't imagine how the concept of systemic racism could be detached from something you worry about politically. And then finally, there's this fallacy threat that hyperpoliticization leads us to commit fallacies. Feminists developed the concept of intersectionality. Therefore, I'm off. I'm not even going to countenance that. So this is like a genetic fallacy. So this leads to doubt. This is the road to doubt. These epistemic liabilities make it easy for various hyperpoliticizers to develop genuine doubt about the status and severity of social harms assailing racial minorities. I hope that is pretty straightforward, but maybe you have questions about how exactly this works. So this brings me to the conclusion and wrapping everything up here. The idea here is that the genuine doubt of many apathetic whites does not necessarily exculpate their apathy. And why is that? It's because for many, their doubt is explained by their tendency to hyper-politicize. So if you recall, we have this puzzle that I originally started out with. How do we make sense of the following 2 facts? One, many whites are apathetic about social harms assailing minorities due to genuine doubts they have about those social harms. They think those social harms either aren't injustices or they're not that severe. And that's why they're apathetic. But then it seems like even this form of apathy is criticizable. It's a vice. And I want to argue that hyperpoliticization can help us understand the reality of hyperpoliticization can help us understand why this form of apathy is still criticizable, because the doubt is itself explained by hyperpoliticization. And so it's tainted by the viciousness of hyperpoliticization. It inherits the viciousness of it as well. So apathy is still a moral vice towards which criticism is apt, even when genuine doubt underwrites that apathy. And I hope that these insights can lead us closer towards Martin Luther King's dream of repenting of things that are creating the greatest tragedies in our current social transition towards justice. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Joel, thank you so much. What an awesome, fascinating and very important piece of work you're working on there. Very interesting. So I don't think we need to do the whole chair of the session calling on people to ask questions. So I think we will just open it to the floor. If anybody has questions, raise your physical or digital hand. There are few enough screens so that I can see all of you. And Joel, if you just want to call on people yourself, and I'll just leave myself out of it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Will.
Thank you.
Zachary.
Hi, Joel. Thanks for that talk. First, I want to do something really quick and just suggest some things that I've recently encountered that seem like they would be right up this alley. One is Robert Talisse out of Vanderbilt has been writing a lot on political polarization, and I think it dovetails nicely with what you're talking about here. I think that would be interesting to you. I just happened to read it the other day and like, oh, this is like fitting together nicely here. And then I wanted to suggest, you brought up kinds of doubting that could come about, whether that's doubting the seriousness of some issue or doubting whether or not there's an issue at all or something like that. It seems to me there's another kind of doubt that shows up quite a bit in this discourse, which is a doubt that it's my duty to do anything about it. And I think that's an important thing to capture, because the kinds you're bringing up seem to go along with, say, like the most sort of right-wing conservative sort of approaches to these issues. But there's this other thing, it's the apathetic progressive, or, you know, the moderate liberal or something like that, who doesn't do anything. And so I think there's a duty doubt that might also fit in nicely as maybe an addition, not a problem for your view, but something you could add to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zachary. I appreciate the recommendation for Robert Tellez's work. And I think you're absolutely right. There is a kind of duty doubt, and some of these doubts are like interconnected. One doubting can lead to another. Yeah, and I think your point about like the apathetic progressive is very important. And I just want to be clear about something. Like I do think there is a lot of apathy amongst progressives too. Some of these examples point to apathetic, say, whites who are more right-leaning. But yeah, like in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, it's one of the best places to live if you're a young white professional. It is not a great place to live if you're an African American. We have intense disparities here. And yet Madison, Wisconsin is one of the most progressive cities in the United States. It is the most progressive city in the Midwest. And when I talk with local justice organizations, they're often like, yeah, it's white progressives who often overlook these things and get defensive. I mean, white progressives can have fragility as well. And I think that leads to the kind of apathy you're describing. So I certainly want to incorporate that into this paper so that it's not so polarizing. But thank you. I'm going to go to Kate Schmidt.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I had a different intuition about why we might want to criticize people based on doubt, and that was that it's too difficult to tell the difference between genuine and non-genuine doubt. So imagine that I'm apathetic and I feel ego threat being called out for it. And I think, well, if this was really important, I would have already done something about it. So as a sort of after the fact rationalization, I'm going to then generate a bunch of doubts to protect my underlying apathy. And so I would think maybe one reason that we feel fine blaming people for this doubt is because we can't really tell whether it's genuine or not. And if it might not be genuine, that's a reason to potentially criticize someone. So I just wondered what you thought, or if you think there's a better way to tell about genuine versus non-genuine doubts.
Thank you for that, Kate. I think you're making a really good point. Like I think what you're saying is absolute. It's very intuitive to me. And on top of that, I would say I think it probably does explain a lot of the, like, I think it's out there. I think a lot of people do this very phenomenon. So I do think it explains some of our intuitions that these people are criticizable. I think I could incorporate that into this paper. I guess what happens is I have these conversations where after I explore the doubt a little bit, it seems like it's not merely post hoc rationalization. Like it's with a lot of people, not all, but with a lot, I come away thinking, oh, like you really do doubt that this inequality is an injustice. Like you didn't just say that to like try to get me off your back. Like you came into this that way. And there's good like Pew research showing that disproportionately large, larger numbers of whites tend to think that like we're okay. Like the United States is a great place for everyone. It's the land of liberty and equality and so on. So I suspect that there is already this genuine creedal commitment to the justice of America, and that's coming out in these doubts and in this apathy. But I love what you're saying, and I would like to include that in the paper, or maybe write another paper about this, or maybe we could write a paper about it. I don't know, but I love what you're saying. All right, thanks, Emma. All right, let's go to Jen Kling.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just echo everyone else and just be like, thank you for this. It's really helpful to think through these kinds of questions. And kind of what I was thinking about, right, because I know that you're sort of writing this in a specific context about sort of specific groups. And I'm interested in this, in your characterization of hyperpolitical, yeah, that as being inordinate. Because I'm wondering if it's always inordinate to be hyper-focused on the political, which is the way that I'm going to recast that, right? So, like, I think there are some cases where it's clearly inordinate, but I can imagine other political situations where it might make a great deal of sense to be hyper-focused on the political. And if you fail to hyper-focus on the political, you're failing in your political obligations to your society or something like that. So I'm just wondering how strong of a role is this inordinate claim playing in your concept here?
Yeah, this is such a good question. One of the worries I had about this way of framing hyperpoliticization is that it's like I'm building in normative things into the analysandum, and then I try to argue, well, this phenomenon is vicious, but like, I mean, yeah, I just built into it that it's inordinate focus. So of course it's vicious. So I kind of worry about a circularity. But then I don't know if that's totally a problem, because I do think that there are analysandum that are inherently, they have moral features, and we can identify further bad making features. So the bad making features I identify are like further ones in addition to the inordinate, I think. Oh, maybe not, because one of them is inordinate focus itself. I don't know. Maybe what I should do is I should say, this isn't a definition of hyperpoliticization. Maybe I should just like do the cases, describe the phenomenon, and then say, it seems to me like this involves inordinate focus. And then go on to say, there are cases where intense focus is not inordinate. And I could try to describe cases where that would be. Do you have thoughts about like what social contexts make intense focus permissible? Will, you have some thoughts?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say, I'm very sorry to say this, but due to our schedule, we are about to move into the next panel. And so perhaps Ashley and Colin and Jennifer, perhaps we could continue this conversation at a more convenient time so we don't spill over into the next group. So just with that in mind, I apologize for you guys not being able to ask your questions. Joel, great answers, wonderful paper. Thank you so much. And I hope you will hang around for more of the conference and take advantage of some of the lunch breaks maybe to continue the conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
So is Victor, do I see Victor?
I just got a notification that he will not be coming. So, I mean, if you'd like to continue chairing, you're welcome to. I'm also happy to chair.
I would be very happy to make up for my tardiness by continuing to chair. So I'm happy to chair the next session. Maybe we could just take a 1 or 2 minute break just for everyone to get ready for the next session and begin just a slightly late.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to session 4, Zoom room 1 of our annual Concerned Philosophers for Peace conference. This session is on statelessness and responsibility. We have 2 presentations. We have Paul Wilson and Julissa Fernandez Rivera. If I mispronounced any of your names, please let me know. We are running a few minutes late, so in the spirit of getting on with things, Paul, would you like to take us away?
Certainly. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be sharing my paper, Creating the Will to Resolve Statelessness. The United Nations High Commission of Refugees is reporting that at the close of 2020, there were 82.4 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide. With the 2021 turmoil in Afghanistan, that number has increased significantly. Historically, a large percentage of forcibly displaced persons become stateless. Statelessness is a problem that the global community is forced to address. In the best of all possible worlds, states would recognize the act upon good ethical reasons to prevent forcible displacement of persons and statelessness. 1, the problem of statelessness. John Locke and Thomas Hobbes supposed that persons enter society from the state of nature. Practically speaking, most people today find themselves situated in one society or another from birth, and their citizenship is their birthright. A society acting as a collective moral agent may target and displace a specific population, making them refugees. It is the action of sovereign states to make some persons stateless that will occupy the attention of this essay. Stateless refugees can be rescued from their statelessness by becoming recognized refugees with a possible path to citizenship. But for many persons, that's an option they never get. The United Nations Commissioner for Refugees has estimated persons who enter a refugee camp could spend up to 17 years in a camp. Internally displaced persons, IDPs, are denied the resources they need to survive and thrive. If all states recognize persons as holders of the international human rights, then IDPs and stateless persons would have a basis for appealing their status. However, not all states do recognize international human rights. Even if recognized, a state can exercise its right to refuse refugees entry and cap the number that can come in. If their home state has rejected people and they have no state of sponsorship, they are a people with no land. For practical purposes, stateless persons are non-persons, and non-persons often become victims of mass atrocity. Displacement of persons from their native land can be driven by genocidal intent. Border crossing for those persons who have been expelled is no guarantee they'll reach a safe haven. Instead, they may enter a hostile land where international rights are not recognized. Then they can be seen as trespassers on a land they occupy. They can be seen then as squatters without citizenship rights or protections. Internal displacement and expulsion from a home state are not everyday events. While the internal displacement and expulsion of people can happen in response to national disasters, it happens intentionally also. And the intentional targeting of people for displacement or expulsion aims to benefit a specific people by harming others. Harm can give way to genocidal intent, that is, the intention to exterminate the people. Discriminatory practices such as segregation and confinement of a people to a ghetto may be seen as gateway activities preceding expulsion. These behaviors are consistent with genocidal violence. This was demonstrated in the Holocaust and in the antebellum South in North America. Those who fail to recognize the plight of IDPs and stateless persons minimally demonstrate moral insensitivity. Discrimination that leads to displacement is an indicator of callousness and a vicious character. 2, stateless persons at the borders of life. The International Declaration of Human Rights recognizes all persons as bearers of fundamental rights, such as the right to life and security. If all states adhered to its covenants, then statelessness would not threaten people. Instead, they would be protected by their native state, or in a worse scenario, then the bordering states would uphold the bills of rights for them. Neither is proven true historically. The result is that stateless people are vulnerable in no less than 4 ways. First, they're cut off from their natural or landed resource. Second, they're forced to occupy a foreign territory that can be environmentally or legally hostile. Third, their economic and social resources are disrupted. And fourth, their ability to appeal to legal and social defenses is eliminated. In respect of time, I won't give annotations to those points. Some stateless persons may not have relied upon their native land to supply basic resources. Nevertheless, their home state would have provided a web of social security. They're cut off from that. IDPs and stateless persons are placed at great risk as a result of their displacement. Minimal risk is that their quality of life is reduced. They cannot freely work, move, or advance in life. Minors have no access to quality education. Adults are not working. Seniors are cut off from medical and social support. Statelessness is an artificial condition that can be remedied. Natural disasters can be addressed. Typically, NGOs provide a stopgap remedy, but there is a way to address statelessness by addressing the states themselves. This is an effective remedy, that is, dealing with the states where the persons have their citizenship. But this can be done on a limited basis. In her paper, Humanitarian Intervention and the Problem of Genocide and Atrocity, Jennifer Kling proposes that neighboring states could enable the escape of displaced refugees. Kling sees the responsibility to protect, R2P, as a starting point for care for refugees. She believes enabling escape is a practice that pacifists could urge on neighboring states. In her thought, this would not violate the sovereignty of the home state, and it would respond positively to the plight of refugees. I agree with Kling that this practice could be consistent with respect of statehood and concern for the refugees. Enabling escape is a positive way to address the problem, but prevention of the problem would alleviate the need for escape. Statelessness could be prevented if the state of origin would rescind its policies and procedures that displace persons. Why and how to address home states must be given further consideration. 3, a bottom-up approach to addressing states of origin that displace persons. The UN High Commission of Refugees accepts the value of the Universal Declaration of Rights. Other nations that support universal rights may exert political and economic pressure upon sovereign states that are responsible for displacement of persons. They can do this through economic sanctions, refusal to offer state aid, or publicly shaming the nation. These measures may motivate some states to address the problem of displaced persons, but they require diplomatic negotiations or monitored enforcement. They don't necessarily result in a reform of the state, so it will cease action of displacing persons. In her article, Ending Statelessness Through Belonging, Christy Belton says, when one considers that states still jealously guard their sovereign right to determine who belongs, it is difficult to imagine how statelessness itself, a byproduct of a state's system malfunctioning, can be resolved by the very actors that generate stateless people in the first place. In our article, Belton analyzes the I Belong campaign that is a global action plan of the IHCR. Belton sees a plan as a bottom-up plan. In the plan, there are 4 steps to take. 1, donate, sign a statement of support. 2, 3, send aid, and 4, share the news. The advantage of the plan is it can be implemented by both stateless people and by those who care to defend the rights of stateless people. Bolton recognizes that the global action plan may be blocked by state sovereignty. I agree with Belton that this is only a complementary plan to avoid the or remedy statelessness. And I suggest a top-down plan should accompany the bottom-up plan. The 4 action steps to address statelessness in the I Belong plan are steps individuals would take. It is the I Belong pamphlet that then lists 10 action steps to take to end statelessness. And these, again, are individual steps. The outcome of these steps could be aggregated, true, but the 4 steps are initiated by individuals. And as we look at donate, share the news, and send the pamphlet, those are things individuals do. The second step of signing the petition could be proactive, and it certainly could get the attention of the state itself. Preventative steps to avoid the problem must begin, then, I would say, at the state level. So addressing appropriate approaches to statelessness. What I call a top-down approach to address statelessness is simply economic and political action taken by states toward other states. Either a state addresses another state for its role in displacing persons, or a state itself reviews and reforms its policies and procedures that result in this displacement. The former is a state-to-state approach, the latter an internal approach to address the problem. Another state can motivate a state to undertake a review of its behaviors, but internal approaches must be willed by the state. Of course, in the aftermath of periods of civil unrest and genocidal violence, a state can be forced to address its problem under a treaty. Under the terms of the treaty the Allies gave to Germany, Germany and the Axis were compelled to remedy the problem of their internally displaced persons. States could be motivated by peers through shame, through sanctions, to reverse their policies. That's possible. But can collectives agree to do something about this? Or can even states do this? These are appeals to negative consequences. If the sanctions are clearly responsive to abuse of human rights, then the message is clear. But these, again, are appeals to negative consequences. So I want to talk about creating the will to resolve statelessness. Fifth, while bottom-up efforts are valuable, the most effective means of addressing the problem is to become proactive in the prevention of statelessness. Like Paul Bartrope and Samuel Totten, I see a realpolitik approach to state sovereignty as a way that states empower themselves and defend exclusionary and discriminatory practices leading to statelessness. Here's the problem. In a Westphalian view of statehood, sovereign states take the pursuit of their own economic and political interests to be their obligation. In other words, sovereign states don't necessarily see themselves as having obligations to their people. The responsibility to protect, hereafter R2P, was developed as a corrective that self-interested view of statehood. But R2P does not neutralize state sovereignty. States still may exercise state sovereignty regarding the treatment of their citizens. What should not be overlooked is a suppressed premise. Sovereign states have a will, and it's their will to pursue their interests. Sovereign states pursue their own interest intentionally, and not as a matter of happenstance. The will some sovereign states lack is not having a will, it's having the will to fulfill R2P for all people in their border. I believe there are good reasons for states to develop that will. And if I'm correct, then states failing to develop that will demonstrate a defect in reasoning rather than an absence of willpower. Not all states recognize universal human rights. When states freely exercise a realpolitik view of sovereignty, they can be morally insensitive to the plight of the stateless. I recommend those states ought to develop a political will for R2P. Why and how? Develop a political will for R2P for an entire population. Good reasons are altruistic or egoistic that could compel a state to develop that will. A state may approach its responsibility to protect as a categorical obligation or a hypothetical obligation. The state that embraces R2P as a categorical obligation sees itself as responsible for all persons within its borders. The state that embraces R2P as a hypothetical sees itself responsible for some persons in its borders, not others. When a state's prepared to fulfill its obligation to protect a select population, it's mimicking the behavior of the Nazis who prepared to protect the interest of Aryans to the exclusion of ethnic groups such as Jews. Rather than upholding human rights, Nazi Germany became a society that voluntarily sacrificed human rights of many people. In practice, states either recognize the rights of life as a universal human right, or they treat human rights as exclusive rights for a few. The state's treatment of the right to life as exclusionary can be reformed if the state has the political will to do it. There are good altruistic reasons for states to internalize R2P as their own categorical obligation. It signals that a state's prepared to embody fully the virtuosity of care for all its citizens. The state's choosing a virtuous character. This choice prioritizes the value of humanitarian care over other values such as purity of race. When a state does embrace R2P as its own categorical obligation, it prepares the way for the state to join in solidarity with other states that prioritize the value of humanitarian care. This contributes both to internal and international stability. This may be seen as a cosmopolitan view of people's rights, and it demonstrates the altruistic state places a negative value on viciousness of protecting a few. An objector may contend states in a realpolitik view are not motivated by virtue of character, but only its own economic interest. States are motivated by their own interest, do place a premium upon economic interest, but those are not the only values a self-interested state has. If a state rejects the altruistic reasons, then there are good egoistic reasons for states to internalize R2P as their own categorical obligation. Promoting economic interest is only one, and it may be short-sighted. States promoting self-interest find themselves confronting a choice like that of egoists. The enlightened egoist will act in their own long-term interest rather than seeking only achievement of immediate gratification. When R2P is seen as a categorical obligation for self-interested states, the long-term value of social stability and maximal human capital can be seen to outweigh the short-term value of displacing some people. If R2P is promoted as a hypothetical obligation, it results in fragmentation of society and its disruption, where welfare of the few is supported by competition and favoritism. The practice results in the disruption of society. Likewise, if R2P is promoted as a hypothetical obligation, it fails to maximize potential of human capital. Knowledge and talent of the disenfranchised or compromised or lost when R2P is treated as a hypothetical obligation. The Nazis failed to foresee that they were sacrificing tremendous human capital by their discriminatory practices. Artistic creations, crafts, inventions, mechanical design, literary works, physicists' discoveries, and many more products of the taboo population were lost to posterity when the Nazis murdered persons whom they refused to dignify as equals or to protect. In the short term, it may seem smart for the state to engage in discriminatory practices and to displace persons, but in the long term, the practice is stupid. An objector may argue that sovereign states do not have to protect all persons in their borders, nor is there any compelling reason for them to adopt R2P as a categorical obligation. This objection is both true and false. Here we see a distinction between what a person has to do and what a person ought to do. I see society as a corporate person that decides to embrace or reject R2P as a categorical obligation. Societal discrimination is an intentional behavior, and it is intentional of the society, but it can be avoided. Why would society avoid it? Well, there are both altruistic motivations and egoistic motivations that answer that question. States could be motivated to end internal displacement or expulsion of its citizens by commitment to R2P. This could happen for altruistic reasons, or it could happen for egoistic reasons. The value of human capital and societal stability from non-discrimination are compelling egoistic reasons why a state would implement a categorical application of R2P. Certainly would boost the economy. The process of displacing persons can free resources that would be used for privileged persons, and it can free these from considerable cost. These require a disruption of society to displace persons. In genocidal displacement of persons, this happens by violent means, and the outpouring of violence can be very costly to citizens and destroy infrastructure. The same resources used for arms could be repurposed and considerable value could be reclaimed. Simultaneously, human capital would be retained and that could enrich society. Conclusion: statelessness is a considerable social harm, and it's one that can be avoided. I recognize that some states may remain skeptics toward international human rights. I recommend that those states ought to create a political will for fulfilling their responsibility to protect R2P. If states were to embrace their R2P for all people on their borders, they would remedy internal displacement and statelessness. To fail to do so is to fail to understand the loss of value that can accompany the displacement of persons. It indicates the state fails to understand the contribution of all peoples are in its own best interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul Wilson there from Shaw University, creating the will to resolve statelessness. So in chairing these online Zoom sessions, I don't think we need to resort to the in-person method of having the chair call upon people's questions. So same as last time, Paul, we'll have people raise their physical or digital hands and you may go to them in the order that you see fit. I believe we have a question in the chat window there, so you might want to open that, Paul. We have a question from Andrew.
Yes.
What is the role of non-state organizations such as ethnic or religious group or unions and professional societies or federations of nations, British Commonwealth, NATO, etc., in creating this will?
Yes. Well, a very important question. I think NGOs, as I indicate in the paper, and I would include that organizations, churches, and so on, certainly can convince, can be advocates for this value of all people. And they certainly can be stopgap measures to help the stateless. In the Kling paper, that was one of the things that these para-state organizations is doing. They are helping to find places for persons to go. But, the state itself can review and listen to these thoughts and decide what's its interest, where is it going, what kind of values will it promote. So, certainly those things can have an influence. Yes.
Okay, any other questions? I had a quick question for you, Paul, if I may. And it seems like the altruistic reason relates to the categorical obligation as you describe it. But it seems like the egoistic reasons provide a sort of merely hypothetical obligation. I was wondering about how you sort of negotiate that tension between these two elements. Is it sort of like, from a moral perspective, we have this categorical obligation, and then in terms of persuading states, persuading individuals to get on board, in terms of cultivating this will to make appeal to these sort of hypothetical benefits of overcoming statelessness. And I wonder if there is a potential tension there, right? Because are we inviting an objection that if it didn't improve state stability and there wasn't a positive role for human capital, would we be inviting a sort of counter argument?
Right. Yes. Okay. A very good question. Well, I see this, categorical obligation as an ideal to work toward. And it is certainly one that I believe all persons supporting universal human rights would be ready to buy into. But when I'm dealing with these states, I'm thinking, of them as persons, collectives, and they may not be at that stage of moral maturity, readiness to engage in that sort of thinking. So from a pragmatic sort of view, pragmatically, they may be prepared to entertain these egoistic views. Pragmatically, they may not be buying into these ideal or absolute values.
Thank you very much, Paul. So you can choose who to go to next. Dave and Greg both have a question.
Okay, I see Dave. Go. Yep.
Thank you. I'll make this quick. So I'm just still wondering if maybe there's some reasonable concerns about the intervention aspect of responsibility to protect, even if it's relatively soft intervention like sanctions. And I guess wouldn't the challenge there be something like, look, it's not clear the big countries like the US and China can be trusted to intervene in any way that is at all altruistic without also having other motives. And we could, of course, point to all of America's interventions in the Middle East and what that has done there. And I mean, wouldn't that be an argument then for something like, shouldn't those countries not intervene at all and simply stick to doing what it can within its borders, say accepting refugees?
Well, okay, a couple of things there. Now, R2P, as it's originally formulated by Evans and then worked on by others, is a sort of ideal. And it's an ideal, an objective that comes in a sort of a vacuum of states in a real politic environment. Well, how can we get them to even think about these people? So R2P, this is what you ought to be doing. And it's formulated perhaps by those who stand outside the very states that practice this displacement. Now, when you're talking about the interventions, okay, I'm thinking about the people that are trying to say, or trying to stand up for the stateless. These would be other states, not the offenders, we'll call them at the moment. And, what kind of interventions do they have? You're saying, a big brother, the United States, China, has such overwhelming force that maybe they need to stand down and just deal with, the refugees. Don't try to overwhelm these smaller states. Well, that is a balance of power. That's also, a question. Well, how are you trying to exert this authority? What are you doing there? What I'm trying to do is get the state itself to undergo an internal review, thinking about what's going on. What am I doing? And again, I'm thinking of the state as a corporate person because it's thinking about what it's doing. It's intentional. It's not happenstance that it pushes people out. It did it for some reason. Why? Why are the Rohingya pushed out of their territory? And why were the Jews? Why did they become internally displaced or pushed out of their territories? So, yep, my attention is directed to that. I hope, Dave, that answers your question. Yeah, I don't see another question, but
we have just a few minutes before we need to move to our next paper. So if you did have a quick question, Greg, we could get it in.
yeah,
Yes.
great.
Yes. This follows a kind of a theoretical trend that I noticed also this morning, which is that the dominant theoretical model of analysis today seems to be liberal. And so I would put this in the same category, which is now the state as an individual. And I worry about this because then this gets us involved in all kinds of analysis, which requires intentionality. So where's the place for more structurally oriented theory?
So you're asking me where would that be? Well, okay, so you want to move away from the state as person. Well, at this point, I'm not trying to unpack how fully the underlying mechanisms that have brought the state to the point of intending what it does. I'm trying to assume, that there is intentionality in what it's doing, and it represents the people, the state, and such. So, certainly we can unpack that. We can do that in different ways. In some of the text, I point out the differentiation between being stateless as being at the mercy of a dictator versus a state, whatever that means. So yeah, we could unpack that, but I'm trying to look at this and say, okay, well, here's something intentional. Have we dealt with that intention? Is there some way to appeal to that? And I wonder, if we get into the weeds of, this thing of trying to deconstruct the state and its mechanisms. Well, have we gotten so far away now that we're not going to be able to address the problem itself, which very practically is right before us? There are millions of displaced persons. Can we do anything about it? Can we have a bottom-up approach? I want to suggest we need something else besides individuals. I could sit here on this seat and cry out all day and get nowhere with the four things because the state may pay no attention to me.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot for that. Really stimulating talk. Now, I don't want to make too many assumptions, but I think our next presentation from Julissa might speak implicitly about this notion of the structural versus liberal conditions. So with that, I'd like to introduce Julissa Fernandez Rivera from the University of Texas at El Paso with her paper, Non-Agential Collectives, Collective Responsibility and the Moral Address Condition. Julissa, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Oh, darn. Sorry, just here we go. Okay, great. So I hope everyone can see my PowerPoint. So thank you again for the introduction. I want to first start off by thanking the organizers as well. I'm very happy and thankful to be here with you all. So before I get started on my presentation, I want to flag right now that this paper is a part of a larger project. I'm interested in how the Latinx community, or what I refer to as the Latinx collective, has forward-looking collective responsibility to address its anti-Black racism and to address how it has benefited from that anti-Black racism. So this paper actually explores how I could go about and defend that thesis. And of course, we can discuss in greater detail the project during the Q&A if anyone is interested. There we go. Great. Okay. So I'll be arguing that certain non-agential collectives in specific situations can be bearers of collective responsibility by being the appropriate subjects of reactive attitudes. The way in which I intend to do this is by exploring how a non-agential collective can meet Strawson's account of reactive attitudes and the moral address condition. Hence, there exist specific cases where certain non-agential collectives are the appropriate bearers of collective responsibility. And the way I plan to do this is by briefly introducing and discussing Strawson's account of participant reactive attitudes and responsibility. I'm then going to discuss how Deborah Tollefson and Kay Matheson have extended Strawson's account of reactive attitudes onto collectives. I'll then discuss Strawson's account of the moral address condition and explain why it is an unsupported assumption to think that collectives need to meet this condition in the exact same manner as individual agents. And lastly, I will discuss my solution as to how certain non-agential collectives can meet the moral address condition, be subjects of reactive attitudes, and bearers of collective responsibility. And the way I plan to do this is by discussing a case by Virginia Held and exploring what her case entails, and then by discussing conditions that non-agential collectives must meet in order to satisfy that moral address condition. So let's get started. So in the debate over free will and moral responsibility, Strawson's account of participant reactive attitudes offers a version of compatibilism. According to Strawson, even if the determinist thesis were true, so if all behavior was determined, then moral blame, punishment, and praise would be unjustified. Even if that were true, we could still hold others and ourselves morally responsible. So his approach and analysis of moral responsibility does not require that he solve the debate or metaphysical issue of determinism. Rather, he claims we care about and take into consideration whether someone's attitudes or actions towards us are of goodwill, affection, indifference, malevolence, and so on and so forth. So on Strawson's account, we do not need this external justification for moral responsibility. Instead, his idea as to what grounds moral responsibility are participant reactive attitudes. Thus, to be held morally responsible is to be the appropriate target of a reactive attitude. And just as a quick example here, let's say that I maliciously go towards a presenter at a conference and just start kicking them. Their reactive attitude of like anger towards me would ground that moral blame and moral punishment. So moving on to how this account of Strawson has been put towards collectives, Tollefson argues that certain kinds of collectives have been and can be the targets of reactive attitudes. The kind of collectives that are the appropriate targets are the ones that are able to meet her normative competence condition. That is, the collective must have the capacity to understand moral demands, guide its behavior and attitudes as a result of the moral demands, and they must have the capacity to deliberate. And she gives us an example of the tobacco industry. So in 1953, the tobacco industry released an advertisement falsely stating there was no connection between cigarette smoking and cancer. And following the release of the advertisement, the industry invested in a decades-long campaign to deceive the public about the dangers of cigarette smoking. And this deception has led to certain reactive attitudes towards tobacco companies from the public, such as anger, resentment, and indignation. So according to Tollefson, the tobacco industry is able to meet her normative competence condition by being able to make decisions such as deciding to lie about the dangers of smoking, to deliberate. We see this deliberation because they had a decades-long campaign to hide the dangers of smoking, and to come to the conclusion to lie to the public. So that is why we can say that the tobacco industry as a collective is the proper target of reactive attitudes, and they can be held accountable in the backward-looking sense for their actions. So now I want to switch over to Matheson. Matheson argues that certain collectives can qualify as moral agents. Through a Strassonian approach, Matheson develops a criterion for moral agency by examining society's practice of holding individuals morally responsible. She argues the criteria for an individual to be a moral agent is actually applicable towards collectives. And there are three main conditions of moral agency, and that is perspective, a capacity for second-order reflection, and sensitivity to moral reasons. So according to Matheson, having a perspective means one has a framework of beliefs, desires, and goals. By having a perspective, an individual is able to respond to their environments. They're able to reason, make choices, and form intentions. For second-order reflection, the individual is able to evaluate their intentions, beliefs, and desires, and they should be able to reflect on and decide if they want to continue endorsing their current intentions, beliefs, and desires. Lastly, sensitivity to moral reasons is a moral agent must be able to understand and react to moral reasoning. So here we are provided a step-by-step theory that shows us how a collective has to function and be structured in order to be parallel to an individual moral agent. So why am I discussing this? Why look at Tollefson and Matheson? So what I found interesting is that their research only allows us to look at collectives that fall under the collective agent category. That is, collectives that can form intentions, make decisions, pursue a goal. And these kinds of collectives are governments, clubs, sports teams, educational institutions, and so on and so forth. So these collectives are what are primarily being looked at. This then leads to certain cases regarding non-agential collectives to be overlooked or altogether ignored. So cases where we may hold negative or positive reactive attitudes towards non-agential collectives are often claimed to be misdirected and a misplacement of one's reactive attitudes. And I found that to be very interesting for my overall project, hence why I wanted to look more into this. So what is the big deal? Why is this the case? So the reason as to why collective action theorists approach collective responsibility in a parallel way with individual responsibility is to meet Strawson's moral address condition. So Strawson argued that in order to be an appropriate target of reactive attitudes, individuals should have the potential to participate in interpersonal interactions. So when an individual meets the moral address condition, they are a part of the moral community, which means they are being regarded as fully responsible moral agents. They qualify as being able to participate in interpersonal relationships, or in other words, they are the appropriate subjects of reactive attitudes. So I am skeptical as to whether collectives have to even meet the moral address condition in the way that individuals do. So next, I will discuss a scenario where a non-agential collective can be a part of an interpersonal relationship, even though it lacks collective intention and action. So when the non-agential collective in this case has the opportunity to engage in interpersonal relationships, I think something changes. So the non-agential collective has the opportunity to meet the moral address condition. And in order to thoroughly explain how this can be the case, I'm going to briefly refer to an argument provided by Virginia Held regarding random groups and collective responsibility. And by doing so, I will demonstrate how I have developed the set criteria that non-agential collectives must meet in order to qualify for the moral address condition. So I want to say right now that Held argues that she argues there are certain special circumstances where a random non-agential collective, or what she refers to in her paper as a random collection of bystanders, can be held morally responsible for failing to perform an action. I want to flag right now that I want to bracket the kind of responsibility she's looking at. She's looking at the failure to perform an action. That sounds like backward-looking responsibility. I'm interested in forward-looking responsibility, and if there are any questions there or confusion, we can discuss that further in the Q&A. So, Held argues, when the action called for in a given situation is obvious to the reasonable person, and when the expected outcome of the action is clearly favorable, a random collection of individuals may be held responsible for not taking a collective action. And there are two important conditions for her argument. First, the action being called for must be obvious to a reasonable person. That is, if a reasonable person could see that it was not possible for the expected action to be performed, then it would be unreasonable to expect the non-agential collective to perform the action. And I want to point out right here, she doesn't tell us more about what a reasonable person is. So a reasonable person is just a person that can see that the expected action can be performed. It's not as if something disallows the non-agential collective to become a collective agent. Second, the second condition is that the expected outcome of the expected action should be clearly favorable. So her case is important to explore because it sheds light on a situation where it would not be uncalled of for a society to have a negative reactive attitude towards a non-agential collective for its lack of performance or lack of collective action. And to illustrate this, let's examine the non-performance case. So for the non-performance case, there are 7 normal strangers. Normal is her, what she refers to, by the way. So 7 normal strangers are sitting apart in a subway car. In this case, the second smallest passenger in full view and hearing of all the other passengers attacks and begins to strangle the smallest person in the subway car. The remaining 5 passengers do nothing, even though they can hear and see what is occurring. According to Held, we will hold the strangers in the subway car morally responsible for failing to collectively stop the strangler because it would be obvious to a reasonable person that the strangler ought to be stopped and that stopping the strangler would have yielded a favorable outcome. If we bracket her reasoning as to how and why the non-agential collective can be held morally responsible, her work brings to light certain interesting features about the interpersonal relationship between non-agential collectives and society. So from the non-performance case, I have located 3 main conditions surrounding a non-agential collective in these specific circumstances. And I believe when this criteria is met, I'm able to justify and show how a non-agential collective meets the moral address condition. Or in other words, the non-agential collective qualifies as a member of the moral community. This then would entail reactive attitudes towards the non-agential collective are justified and that the non-agential collective can be held collectively responsible. And so the conditions are, first, the non-agential collective should be structured in such a way that it has the capacity to become a goal-oriented collective. Second, the non-agential collective has to be in a situation or a specific location where a moral problem requires collective action. And third, the action being called into question is obvious to a reasonable person and the expected outcome of the action is clearly favorable. So on the left, I have the conditions for the new moral address condition that non-agential collectives have to meet. And on the right, I have the non-performance case. So let's say these 7 normal strangers are all able-bodied. They all have some sense of morality and right and wrong. They have some sense of what the law is. I would say that they have the capacity to become a goal-oriented collective. For the second condition, let's say that the second strongest passenger is built in such a way that it's going to require more than one person to stop the strangler. So we can imagine a case where it's going to require 5 people to come and work together to help the smallest person in the subway car. And lastly, I think it is safe to say that it would yield favorable results or a favorable outcome to stop the strangling. So what can we take away from this? I think that non-agential collectives under certain circumstances can genuinely meet the moral address condition, and they are a part of the moral community. I think it shows that non-agential collectives that meet this criteria set can be appropriate targets of reactive attitudes and therefore bearers of collective responsibility. I think interestingly enough, being a part of a non-agential collective does not automatically exempt you from the moral community. And lastly, we can discuss situations that are traditionally overlooked in the general literature on collective responsibility. So I know this was a short presentation, but I'm excited for the Q&A because I think we can kind of dissect and discuss more what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And so Q&A, yes.
Lisa, is that the correct way to pronounce your name?
It could be Julissa or Julissa. I go by both.
Lisa, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. So we have around 10 minutes for Q&A. That only gives us 3 minutes to shift over to the next session if we wish. So around 10 minutes, we'll do the same as last time. Feel free to raise your physical or digital hands. And Julissa, it'll be up to you to call on questioners. So bearing in mind that some people are raising questions in the chat window.
Right.
Andy Fiala has asked another question there. Would you like, I can read that out if you prefer.
Yeah, you can read it.
So Andy asks, how homogeneous does the collective need to be? In other words, what do we do about disagreements within the collective? For example, Andy gives the war in Iraq. Are those of us who are opposed to the war responsible? Is the US as a whole responsible, even though perhaps, who knows exactly how many, but many Americans were opposed to the war?
So that's a fantastic question. So first of all, I want to say that we can't hold non-agential collectives. I think we can't hold non-agential collectives in the backward-looking sense. That being, we can't morally praise or morally punish or morally blame because they don't have the ability to perform collective actions. However, I think we can apply forward-looking responsibility. So that is, the collective has some kind of responsibility to remedy or prevent further harm. So I'm really excited that you used the example of US citizens or Americans because I think they would fall under the non-agential collective category here. And I'm going to plainly argue that even though there were many people against the war, we've still benefited from it. I want to say economically, and as a whole, I want to say morality would demand that the US members of the US come together in a goal-oriented way as a goal-oriented collective to remedy or further prevent that kind of harm. I'm not sure if that fully answers that question, but I can discuss it more if you would like.
Can I just jump and unmute? That's useful, I think. But what you're actually pointing towards is why we want to make this judgment, either retrospective or forward-looking. It could be there's different reasons, right? Like retrospectively, we're looking for reparations, we're looking for
people to imprison or hold liable for war crimes. Forward looking, maybe we're thinking more about, I don't know, education, structural changes such that
Yeah,
we make better decisions. Is that in the ballpark of what you're thinking
that
about?
is definitely. So in my larger project, I am interested in how we could remedy, right? Like, how do you do that? I know from the very basic is that morality demands a goal-oriented collective, but a goal-oriented collective to do what and how? That is a bigger question that I haven't fully fleshed out yet to answer. But I think you hit the nail on the head there. That maybe through education, that's how we can better educate new generations, become more aware of the atrocity that comes with war. But for the sake of this paper, I was primarily just interested in being able to defend and hopefully show that we can have this conversation and we can say, look, like there are these cases where we have non-agential collectives and they have that forward-looking responsibility. And right now with the literature on collective responsibility, we can't really say that. We can't even really explore it.
Andy says thanks in the chat window. So Dave?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the paper. So
Thank
I'm going
you.
to ask kind of theoretical question, just
Great.
specifically why you're drawn to the Strassonian model, and just I think once you get rid of the need for the backwards looking stuff, suddenly like the agency for other people, the agency stuff has been not quite as important. I'm just wondering, two at the top of my head, alternatives would be something like, I think Avia Pasternak has a paper where she uses complicity, which you can, some kind of complicity that generates forward-looking obligations. And then, of course, Iris Marin Young, who has her social connection theory, which doesn't really involve intentional participation. I mean, completely unstructured groups can be participating through certain structures.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious why the Strassonian picture, or why you're drawn to it.
So I was drawn, so a lot of this began, I read a paper from George Yancey, and he discusses like this gift that he gives to white Americans about racism. And what I found really interesting is how people have these reactive attitudes towards non-agential collectives and how immediately they get ignored or downplayed or told you can't really feel that way because that's not a collective agent, right? So some people have said that the white collective or white people in the United States may not, as a collective, and let's just say for argument's sake, just for what I'm saying right now, may not as a collective agent be purposely oppressing people of color. So that reactive attitude of like expecting white people to help out, to be anti-race, to be actively anti-racist doesn't hold. And I kind of wanted to be able to say, no, those reactive attitudes are valid. They actually can be applied to these groups, not just to collective agents. So that's really how I got interested in the Strassonian approach. But I am excited that you told me about these two philosophers because I'm hoping to get into a PhD program, and it would be exciting to read more about their theories and see how I can engage in them. There, yes, Greg.
Hi, thank you. And I think I was a little abrupt with Paul Wilson, so I do want to apologize. I just jumped right into the challenging question without first saying, I'm so glad you talked about the problem of the the displaced stateless. So I apologize for that. But let me also say, Julissa, that I really enjoyed your presentation as well, and the sorts of possibilities that it opens up. I certainly heard a lot of the backlash against critical race theory being kind of addressed here, but I wondered if in furtherance of bringing these two conversations together, we could talk about the overlooked situation of statelessness, certainly something that El Paso is acutely aware of. So how would you apply this to the overlooked situation of statelessness in El Paso?
Can you expand a little bit more on that question?
Right. Yeah. Paul is saying, we should have a different attitude altogether toward the stateless.
Right.
And I would imagine El Paso is a good place where we can see how the stateless are being handled today.
Yeah.
And Paul is saying, no, we need the R2P. We need the responsibility to protect.
Right. Okay. I think I'm following now.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that with the 3 conditions I provided, we could provide that argument that, and I think I have said this in conversation with some people, that, members of El Paso, citizens of El Paso, or people that just live here in general, I think we do have that forward-looking responsibility, that obligation to become a goal-oriented collective and actually do something about the way immigrants have been treated at the border. And I think, one way we can do this is by education, and maybe grassroots and organizations. But I think we could say, we do have the capacity to become that goal-oriented collective. I think on a human level, we're kind enough. People were really outraged at how immigrants were being thrown in tents in the hot weather. I did some volunteer work, not at the detention centers, but with people who were going from detention center to other parts of the US. And those resources are there. I think there's a good number of people who do want to volunteer and help. I think coming together to address and look at this problem would yield positive results, not just for immigrants, or for like the altruism that comes from helping others, but ego-wise as well. I think that would yield favorable results. So I think you're right. I think statelessness and what I'm talking about can be used together. I'm not sure if I answered that question. I kind of forgot what it was. I'm really sorry.
I think it was a great start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I kind of went on like a tangent.
Well, welcome to the club.
Thank you.
I think that about wraps up our time here. So I'd just like to say, Lisa and Paul, thank you so much for your important, well-researched and impassioned work. We really appreciate it. I've just pasted the link to Zoom Room 2 in the chat window, because up next, we have a sort of workshop on teaching nonviolence. So there's a link there for you guys to follow. I hope to see some of you at other presentations. And just again, let's put our hands together to thank 2 excellent presentations. Thank you so much.